Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Josh Mansfield, a teacher with the Demon, and with me is Nathan Fox, one of the founders of LSATdemon.com and the weekly podcast Thinking LSAT. Our email today, Nate, comes from Harry with the subject of offensive versus defensive strengtheners or assumptions.
Hi, I hope all's well. I've been using LSAT Demon for a few months, and I've appreciated your video explanations. In the past, Nate has made a distinction between offensive and defensive strengtheners or assumptions. Can you talk a bit more about this distinction? I'm also interested to hear any guidance you may have about making answer choice predictions for defensive strengtheners. They seem harder to make. Thanks for your time, Harry. Josh, have you heard me talk about offensive strengtheners versus defensive strengtheners?
I have heard you talk about it, and I have an example that I use because I teach this actually in my prediction fundamentals class quite frequently, and we talk about offensive versus defensive strengtheners and how, especially to make ourselves aware of them. Before we get to the predictions, I think we could just start by making sure for those who maybe haven't heard those videos, clarifying what they are. So I'll let you take that, and then I'd love to jump in on the predictions point.
Okay, cool. So how about just a real simple example? Suppose I said, if you're in Manhattan, you're in New York City. Therefore, Jimmy is in New York City. Okay.
Okay.
Right away, I mean, the first thing out of your mouth should be, what? What? Where? Huh? How does the rule about Manhattan being in New York City apply to Jimmy?
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy is the new shit that you brought up in your conclusion. You don't have any premise about Jimmy. You don't get to make a conclusion about Jimmy if you don't have a premise about Jimmy.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So to make that argument actually work, again, we have the premise, if you're in Manhattan, you're in New York City. We have a conclusion, Jimmy's in New York City. Well, that only makes sense if we know that Jimmy's in Manhattan.
Right.
That's the only way, literally the only way to take the evidence we have and link it to the conclusion we want, which is Jimmy's in New York City. If I only have one premise, Manhattan is in New York City, and I'm trying to prove that Jimmy is in New York City, then I need to prove that Jimmy's in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I would call an offensive strengthener. What I mean is it's positively building the case that takes the evidence we have and proves the conclusion we want. And it's also a sufficient assumption of the argument because it's enough. Sufficient means enough.
Let me add an example in there, because sometimes those offensive strengtheners, people look for answer choices that are sufficient assumption answers. And they assume that the strengthener is going to complete the argument. I could totally see an answer choice, though, that says something like, Jimmy mentioned that he has an upcoming work conference in Manhattan.
Oh, totally,
right?
Totally. And so that would be like, hey, at least we're edging toward the idea.
Right.
But the world's best strengthener is the one that takes the evidence we have and just hot glue guns it to the conclusion we want, right? Where it's just like, hey, this is proven. We've proven it. It's enough. We win.
Yes.
That's the best offensive strengthener, is you just move the ball across the goal line, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
If we can't have that, we can have a whole range of second bests. And as Josh says, things like, Jimmy owns an apartment in Manhattan. Oh, well, you own an apartment in Manhattan, you probably are likely to spend some time there. Jimmy has Broadway tickets this weekend. Okay, that's pretty good. Jimmy's going to there's no playoff baseball in Manhattan. What's in Manhattan? Jimmy's on the New York subway right now. It's like, oh, well, okay. Or Jimmy's on the subway right now.
Sure.
Well, increases the odds. Those all, I think, are offensive strengtheners. They feel straightforward. You could have predicted them because it's like, well, this is all evidence in favor of the idea that Jimmy is in fact in Manhattan, which would then prove that he's in New York City based on the evidence we have.
Yep.
Harder strengthen questions are frequently, though, you won't find that. That just won't be there in the answer choices. That's still what you're looking for, though.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're hoping to find when you go into the answer choices. But sometimes on a harder strength question, you have to settle for something like Jimmy's not in Chicago. Wait, how does that prove that he's in Manhattan? Well, it doesn't. But if he were in Chicago, then it would be impossible for him to be in Manhattan. Therefore, Jimmy's not in Chicago defends against the possibility of him being somewhere else. And I would call that a defensive strengthener. It's also a necessary assumption of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
It's necessary because if Jimmy were in Chicago, then he can't be in Manhattan. So if Jimmy's in Chicago, the argument fails. Therefore, Jimmy's not in Chicago is necessarily required for the argument. If you're in Manhattan, you're in New York, therefore Jimmy's in New York. And the reason why I think Harry's right here that it's going to be a lot harder to predict if the answer turns out to be a defensive strengthener.
Mm-hmm.
But coming up with objections helps.
Right.
It primes you for
Yes.
the type of thing, right? So like you might think about that. You might go, "What, Jimmy? Jimmy could be on the International Space Station for all I know." Well, okay, there is a defensive strengthener, also a necessary assumption of the argument. Jimmy is not currently on the International Space Station.
Right.
Jimmy could be abducted by aliens for all I know. Yeah, there's a necessary assumption and defensive strengthener that Jimmy is not currently abducted by aliens.
So let's talk predictions then, because to that point, Nate, they're right that Jimmy could be anywhere. And so making those predictions, and I mean, even go back to our offensive strengtheners, right? That Jimmy is Manhattan, that Jimmy has Broadway tickets, that Jimmy has a work conference this weekend in Manhattan, right? All of those things are correct answers to strengthener questions. And so
Yep.
you could have between offensive and defensive infinite.
If there
Okay.
wasn't something better there.
Right.
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 And that's why it's tricky, because it's like if you read A and it says Jimmy's not on the International Space Station, you have to, I mean, my reaction to that is going to be a shrug. I'm going to go, well, that's a necessary assumption of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
If you make that true, then it helps the argument this much, because I didn't think the odds were very high that he was on the International Space Station to begin with. But
Mm-hmm.
I can see how, technically speaking, that is a necessary assumption of the argument. I mean, if this is a necessary assumption question, that's the answer. Slam
Yes.
dunk.
Right. Because there's only one
But
correct.
if it's a strengthen question, you're looking for the best strengthener, and there could be something there that is necessary but doesn't actually strengthen the argument very much.
Yeah.
And if I get down to B or C or D or E and I see Jimmy owns a condo in Manhattan and goes there 51 out of 52 weeks in the year, well, okay, that doesn't prove that he's there, but it proves that he's there a lot.
Yeah.
And if he's there that much, well, then that does a hell of a lot better job helping prove that he's in Manhattan than he's not on the International Space Station does.
Right.
Even though that's necessary, right?
Yep.
That has to be true, or else the argument fails. But that's still not the best strengthener.
Yeah.
Because the best strengthener is going to be something that actually moves you toward your conclusion of he's in Manhattan, or he's in Manhattan, which proves the conclusion he's in New York.
Right. So in that predictions class, recognizing sometimes you're going to have defensive strengtheners or things that might very, very slightly strengthen, but then you'll find a better one. Recognizing there's a whole bunch of different answer choices that could be correct.
Yep.
I discourage my students from like just saying a singular prediction and locking onto it, at least initially. Instead, what I recommend is, because the sentence is going to, or the question is going to say something like, which of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument? I'll have students who just say, oh, okay, so I'm looking for something that strengthens it, and moves on. And they don't really understand or own what that means in the context of the passage. Now, is this a prediction in the sense that it's going to be the direct answer? Not necessarily. But what I tell them to do is to take the argument and to restructure it and like take that language and restructure it in the question. So what I would say then is I'm looking for something that shows increased evidence that Jimmy is in New York City or not somewhere else.
In Manhattan.
In Manhattan, excuse me, in
Yeah.
Manhattan or not somewhere else.
Yeah.
And just simply taking the time to kind of reframe that around the argument itself helps make sure you identified the conclusion and make sure that you didn't, it just checks your reading, make sure you did a
Yep.
good job, and then it primes your brain for, okay, I know exactly what I'm
Yeah.
looking for. And if you want to come up with an example, then great.
There's a million ways to strengthen. And so you shouldn't have one prediction.
Yes.
You should have a lot of predictions. There are also a million ways to weaken. So you should have a million
Same
predictions
thing.
for a weaken
Yep.
question. That means that there are also a million necessary assumptions for every argument, because every weakener, if you just phrase it as the opposite, then it becomes a necessary assumption.
Yeah.
Right. Again, like, what if, Jimmy's not playing in the playoff baseball game at Dodger Stadium today. Okay, I didn't think he was, but he better not be, because if he were, right, that would be a huge weakener.
Right.
Therefore, it's necessary that he's not playing at Dodger Stadium today.
Yep.
So you could go on forever with weakeners. Like, he could be here, he could be there, he could be this other place. Maybe he hates New York City. He's never been there. Would never go there. What if there's a force field around New York City? Jimmy would vaporize if he ever tried to cross the force field. Well, those are all like crazy, like wild shit, right?
Right.
But
right.
if any of those were true, then it would ruin the argument. So they are all good weakeners, and they are all necessary assumptions of the argument. Contrast that with something like, if this were a sufficient assumption question.
Mm-hmm.
If this is a sufficient assumption question, the answer is Jimmy is in Manhattan. Or something like, the only place Jimmy's ever been is Manhattan. Or Jimmy would be dead if he's not in Manhattan. Or something like, where it's just like, okay, you're going to put Jimmy in Manhattan,
Right.
one way or the other. Because on a sufficient assumption question, they're asking you to prove the conclusion correct. So there we have to have not just an offensive strengthener, but we have to have a dispositive offensive strengthener where it just ends the case.
Yes.
Proves the conclusion of the argument. So you don't really want to be that open-minded in your predictions on sufficient assumption questions. You also don't want to be that open-minded in your prediction on, say, a main conclusion question. I mean, the main conclusion of that argument was Jimmy's in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not going to be like rolling with it on those kinds of questions. You're going to have a prediction, you're going to lock in, you're going to go find it. That's the answer. But on strengthen, weaken, necessary assumption, you want to be sort of predicting the types of things that would be good.
Yes. Yeah.
And then picking the best one.
Yeah. The way I describe or define predictions in my class is that predictions are tools that we use to evaluate answer choices. Now,
Sure.
On conclusion questions, that evaluator better be an exact replica to scale, right? Like
Right.
It needs to be identical. They should be one and the same. But on strength and weakeners, it's about understanding what the question is asking us and kind of replicating that understanding of the implications of the argument in a way that we then can use it to evaluate answer choices.
Yeah, you might predict the answer exactly. Don't be surprised when you do. But you might also, it can help you in two ways. It can prime you to recognize the right answer when you read it, because you'll go, oh, that's a good one too. I didn't think about, I thought about this other thing. I thought about, maybe I had 3 predictions. This isn't any of those predictions, but it's the type of thing that helps this argument.
Right.
I see that now because I made these other predictions. I get it. There's a lot of different ways to strengthen this argument, and that's one of them. Cool. Great. That's a good strengthener. It also should help you to more easily dismiss wrong answers, because you've got this, you've got 3 predictions. You read A and it's like, how does that help? I've got this and this and this, all of which obviously help. How would that help? Okay, next.
Yeah.
Anything more for Harry, or I think we did a pretty good job there.
I think so too. That's a great question. I love talking about this. So
when is that predictions class? What's it called again? And when do you teach that class?
Yeah, it's Prediction Fundamentals. It's on Thursday nights. It's at 7:30 Eastern. I also teach Saturday Brunch LR, which is at noon Eastern. I do the same things.
You can't teach logical reasoning without teaching logical reasoning predictions.
Yes,
I mean, every
yep.
class on logical reasoning is about predicting the answer.
It is. I picked up that class. It was titled something else, and it is my prediction fundamentals class. So
Okay.
that is.
So
Yeah.
for Demon Live subscribers, Josh teaches Thursdays and Saturdays. Demon Premium and Live subscribers can also just watch the video 24 hours a day. Watch the recordings of that class if you want. Thank you, Harry, for writing in. Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you would like to ask us a question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.